Yeah.
You guys figured out all the rates.
Yeah, so that'll be going forward with this year's,
Can you get another 2 minutes, or do you feel?
whatever you call the whole rate package. Yeah, it sounds like it's gonna be, sounds like that's a pretty minor item in the broader rate package, so Jeremy's pretty confident that we're good to go on that, yeah. Yeah, there's so many moving parts to this whole thing. I mean, the next challenge is gonna get, actually getting the shipping line, the terminal operator to do their, what they're supposed to do.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Feel free to grab a cookie or coffee or other refreshments on your way to the table. We have extra pens for folks over there. If you need any meeting materials, we have the PowerPoint and an agenda over there on the table as well. While a couple more people are signing in, welcome to Silver Power's 2020 IRP public process, our first public meeting. We're so glad you could all come. My name is Jenny Thacker. I'm with PRR. We are helping with the facilitation of this process, and we'll introduce everybody else here in just a moment. But before we start with introductions, just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, the restrooms are through this door. You need to take the elevator and head to the ground floor, which is, the button is G, and the restrooms will be straight ahead of you. And the Wi-Fi, for anybody who's using Wi-Fi, it's just Tacoma Guest, capital T, capital G, all one word, and there's no password. And with that, I think we could probably get started on introductions. And as we go around, actually, you know what? Let's go over the agenda first, as folks are heading in. So we're going to start out with the agenda and the objectives. We'll do some introductions, and a little, you'll tell us why you're here and what you hope to get out of it. Rachel's going to go over what the public process for the IRP process is, and we'll do some IRP 101s, just what the basics are. We'll talk a little bit about the focus areas of the 2020 IRP, and then we'll learn about the modeling tools in this process. And then we'll wrap up. There'll be a little bit of time for public comment if we need it, and we'll go over next steps and action items. And the purpose of this process is so that you can know how you can contribute to the integrated resource planning process. And in order to contribute, you need to understand how the process works, so we'll go over that. And also so that you understand what the big questions are that the process needs to answer. Those are our goals for today. With that, let's start introduction. I've already introduced myself. I'd like to start with somebody who is not Tacoma Powery. Connor. And Connor, can you just introduce yourself and tell us? Yes, we're going to use the mic also because we have somebody calling in, at least one person on the phone, so I want to make sure everyone can hear. And why you're here today, what you hope to get out of the process. And I'll describe here.
My name is Connor Tompkins. I'm with Praxair. We're an industrial gas company in Fife. I was asked to participate in my first integrated resource plan, so just here to learn about it, see what I can contribute. I've been with Praxair 5 years, engineer mechanical by schooling, from New York and California, then Tacoma.
I'm Javier Figueroa, and I'm with the City of University Place. I'm on the council. I'm on my third term. that being said, one of the reasons I really wanted to be here because I've heard about B1, and I want to make sure I could see this room. Just kidding. So, as a city that uses PPU exclusively, we're concerned as a council what's going on in the pipeline and changes or impacts that may affect PUP in our community. And along with that, it's just a general interest. I have a long background of power utility experience, and so it's just in general just have a great interest to see where PPU is going in the region with this plan. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ruth Ann Schoenbacher, and I moved to Tacoma from Washington, D.C., previously from New York State before that. And here, my husband is active duty Air Force, but I think I'm listed as other on the worksheet. Generally, I mean, I've worked in energy for the last 5 years. I've been supporting Air Force as a contractor like Booz Allen Hamilton, but I'm not here representing them. So I'm hoping to just get a better understanding of the IRP process. I'm very interested in it, just as a learning opportunity, and also just to contribute how I can. So, glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Clay Norris. I'm the section manager over power management, which includes the resource planning function. And, I'm here to kind of understand what folks in the community are interested in and concerned about.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Sliger. I'm an engineering professor at Tacoma Community College. I'm the chair for computer science, astronomy, physics, and engineering. I got to spend 9 months here on a sabbatical a few years ago, and I really enjoyed spending time hearing about how they're being put together, the integrated resource plan, spending a little bit of time with grants down to support. I think this is a great opportunity to see what's happening in our community, and also to always try to see about ways that we can work together with Tacoma Community College and TPU.
Hi, my name is Graham Vandershelton. I'm with Seaport of Tacoma and the Northwest Seaport Alliance. I'm here, first of all, to learn today. It's my first time I've been involved with an integrated resource plan. So really looking forward to the learning opportunity and also looking forward to better understanding how the port and with our sort of longer-term electrification goals and initiatives can kind of become a bigger part of this sort of thing.
I'm Lauren Walker-Lee. I'm the Executive Director of Tacoma Community House, an organization that has served immigrants and refugees in the Hilltop neighborhood for 110 years. January was our 110th anniversary. I'm here to make sure that immigrants and refugees and diverse communities are stable. Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Watt, and I work for the Bonneville Power Administration. I'm Tacoma Power's Power Account Executive, so I have a transmission account executive counterpart as well. And I'm here to learn more about how Tacoma is actually going to fill in behind all the power that Bonneville sells. I'm looking forward to seeing what the preferred alternative is.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Haig. I'm here representing the Sustainable Tacoma Commission. So we're kind of looking at the environmental aspects of the IRP. During my day job, I actually work for the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Lab, where I do energy grid resiliency work.
Hi, my name is Garrett Tomlinson. I work here at Tacoma Power in resource operations and trading, and I will be presenting a little bit later on our Tacoma system model and how we did that modeling for the IRP.
Hi, I am Rachel Clark, and I'm managing our integrated resource plans here. And I'm interested to hear what all of you have to say. And we will do our best to do sort of a basic overview of IRPs for all the people who aren't familiar with it. And we have a couple folks in the back here. The end. That last to be the end.
My name is Michael Ketsey. I'm with Tacoma Public Utilities.
relatively new here, so I'm interested in in what the integrated resource plan is and the process to go about putting it together.
Hey folks, my name is Marquise. I'm actually your assistant for LDBay. I'm trying to learn a bit more about the IRP process and some of the there's climate in these models and the uncertainty component. So mostly looking to absorb and see how this unfolds.
Hello, I'm Bruce Martin. I'm the Energy Resource Manager at Westrock. We're Tacoma Power's largest load on their system, and I'm interested in participating in this process and seeing how it's going to play out, because of what Tacoma does on power and power rates in the future has a large impact on our business.
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Almaz Nagesh, and I'm a power analyst here at Tacoma Power. I work in the Integrated Resource Plan, Integrated Resource Planning Group, and I do the modeling of the WEC, which is the western region of the U.S. and parts of Canada as well, and that feeds into the IRP process. And obviously, I'm here because I want to hear what you have to say, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit something later.
I'll miss the game on it. All right, and we have a couple other folks here who are helping to take notes so that we can make sure we're capturing this process.
So my name is Ray Johnson. I work for Play and the folks in the IRP group. And so, yeah, just really interested to hear the perspectives on this IRP. I think it's going to be, you know, significant in a way, kind of some of our previous IRPs, more significant in that we're getting closer to some real power supply decisions. So I think it's, we're particularly interested in kind of listening to your perspectives, and, you know, as kind of we go forward. So thank you all for coming.
Hi, I'm Danielle Spaghetti. I am the power analyst here at Tacoma Power, and I will be helping modeling the resources in our system model. Hi, I'm Mila Lassie. I work with Jenny at PRR, and I'm here to support this meeting and make sure that everything is captured.
So to help Mila and our other note takers, there might be times when I ask you to repeat yourself. Oh, yes, you're right, the phone. Yes. Can you hear us?
I sure can. I sure can. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. This is Christina Rupp. I apologize for not being present. I had spine surgery 3 weeks ago, so I'm unable to be there in person. I'm representing two organizations. One is the South End Neighborhood Council for City of Tacoma, and then also I'm the director of post-secondary pathways for Palmer Scholars here in Tacoma, with a trades-based focus for disconnected youth of color in Pierce County. I'm looking forward today to learning more about the IRP process and what's happening at TPU, and how those impacts will have an impact on our diverse population in the South End District of Tacoma. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we go through, Rachel's going to start our presentation here on the public process, but if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands during the presentation, and we'll make sure that you get heard either then, or we might ask you to hold your question until the end if that's what makes more sense. But Christina, on the phone, we can't see you raise your hand, so feel free to, if you have something to say, just let us know, okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, with that, Rachel, my turn. All right, your turn. If I can get this to work. Okay, see how this goes. Sit down. All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. I don't want it too close so it's not overwhelming. Okay, so this is just working. I tried it.
through it. The mouse always works.
Does it?
The clicker doesn't work.
Okay, let me take the mouse over here. Because it did work earlier, but.
Oh, the mouse went.
Not responding. Oh. Okay, well, now it is. Okay.
That looks like it'll probably work.
Yep, okay. Okay, so the objective of public process is to listen and understand stakeholder objectives, your objectives and concerns, provide a forum for productive feedback with you all, and then to just generally increase community understanding of our planning process. The public process centers really around these 4 workshops that we're holding, starting with this one. And at the same time, we try to involve other members of the public as best we can. Believe it or not everybody in the world wants to participate in 4 long workshops on the IRP process. But we try to, get materials out there, occasionally post stuff on social media and on our website, and try to, get people involved to the level that they can participate more generally. Okay, so we'll go over the whole workshop agenda at the end, but generally speaking, today is hopefully helpful for some of you. It's just a primer on the IRP process. What is an IRP? And although you're more than welcome to ask questions and make comments throughout, we're not expecting, really meaningful feedback in this first one. This is more informational. That being said, you're welcome to comment whenever you want. And as we progress through, there'll be more opportunities to provide input on some of these things, like feedback on how we model the future and sort of some of the intricacies of the portfolios that we might consider, and what we ultimately recommend, and sort of the next steps after the IRP. That's somewhere else that we can really use feedback. Full disclosure, we may not be able to take every single recommendation or thought into, we may not be able to incorporate every single one into the IRP. We will consider all of them, and they may make their way into this IRP. They may end up being something that we consider or incorporate into the next IRP. It kind of depends on what the feedback is and what the comment is, but we will definitely consider everything you have to say. Our commitment to you is that we will have materials posted before the workshop 1 week before, in case you have time and interest in reading them ahead of time. If you don't, it's okay, but they'll be there in case you want them. And then we'll provide notes within 10 days after the workshop. Any questions on the public process before we move on to IRP stuff? Very done. So let's start with IRP 101. So there are a lot of different ways that you can define what an IRP is, and reasons for doing them. I'm partial to this first definition. It's basically just a way to help utilities plan in an uncertain future. The integrated part of the integrated resource plan is getting at the fact that we're trying to consider not just one-off resource decisions individually, but considering all of our different resource options at the same time, be they generation kind of resources or demand side resources. So that's why it's integrated. So I think this picture on the right-hand slide is a really good analogy for integrated resource planning. So we do an integrated resource planning 20 years into the future, right? And in this picture, you see, right in the very front, right in front of you, you can kind of see where things are going. We're going in a straight line. But then the further and further you get out into the future, further you get out along this path, the sand is starting to cover up where things are headed. You could assume it goes just straight, and it might just go straight. It might be a straight line for eternity. But this path could veer off to the right, it could veer off to the left, and this is kind of one of the things we have to deal with in the integrated resource plan. It's a 20-year plan, and we don't necessarily know what things are going to look like in 20 years. Luckily, I'm going to say this, we do update the IRP every 4 years. We do a full redo of our IRP analysis every 4 years, and then we do a smaller update every 2 years. This is one of our this is one of our big IRPs, our 4-year update. We did our last, or our 4-year IRP. We did our last IRP update in 2017, and normally would have done our next full IRP in 2019, but due to some personnel changes and changes in our modeling tools, we held off till 2020, which is still within the time frame that we have to submit our next IRP to Department of Commerce. So our IRP is actually due to Department of Commerce on September 1st, 2020, and we'll be aiming to get it approved by our Public Utility Board in early to mid-August, and then submitting it shortly thereafter. So this slide is just to show you that we're not the only state that requires integrated resource planning. This is actually a little outdated, and there may be some other states that have upped their IRP requirements. California, for example, I know has now mandates IRPs, particularly for the purpose of making sure that utilities are going to be able to meet their renewable energy targets, and then for actually the resource needs planning. So this is kind of basically what we do in an IRP. We take a look at our current portfolio. We assess whether we have a need for a resource. If we do, then we take a look at different potential sets of resources, so portfolio of resources, do a full lot of modeling analysis to see how they perform under different conditions, identify the portfolio that best meets the utility's needs, and then we spell out our action items for following up with that choice and for learning more about the things that we need to know more about. And just to give you an example of what we did in what we found in the last IRP, this is our 2017 update. The last IRP found that we were in a good position, and that's one of the key assumptions there was assuming that we kept our current portfolio. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And really, the only resource we needed was conservation. So these were the action items from the last IRP and the progress we've made towards them. So in the interest of time, I'm not actually going to go through all of the things that we've done, but I do want to say if any of these things are of particular interest to you, you want to hear more about them, please come up to us afterward today or email me later and let me know. We'll give you more information on any of them. And maybe even put something up on the website if there's interest. Okay? I'm trying to leave lots of time for the modeling discussion. That's the really interesting part. So let's get into a little bit now on how we actually deal with that uncertainty we talked about before. So as I mentioned before, our IRP goes out 20 years, and there's a lot we don't know about what the world will look like in 20 years. So rather than just kind of make a single guess at what the future is going to look like and either be very right or very wrong, we model potential portfolios with a range of different conditions to understand how it'll perform in a lot of different potential features. So how do we actually do that? And this slide's a little different from what I posted on the website originally, in case anyone was looking at the slide. They'll be updated. So I like to think about the way we deal with uncertainty in the IRP in two ways. I'm going to start on the right side over here. So the first thing we do is that we allow for kind of that regular variability that we expect to see from year to year. Weather conditions, water and temperature being major ones, and different prices. So I'll also talk a little bit more about what we actually vary, but we come up with about a little over 280, I believe. Is that right? Yep. 280 simulations that we run through our model with varied weather conditions and price conditions. So that's just, like I said, to account for that sort of year-to-year variability that we expect to see no matter what the future holds. The other thing that we do is we come up with scenarios. So typically we start with what we call a base case, and that's kind of our business as usual case, where we just assume that existing laws are in place. We don't kind of make guesses at what future laws might look like, or what future laws might look like. And we use our official Tacoma load forecast, which is also kind of it's also kind of a business as usual load forecast. It doesn't kind of project out massive increases in EV penetration beyond what might already be in trends that we've already seen, just as an example. And then we move on from the base case and start modeling alternative futures, kind of scenarios of other things that might happen that would have a big impact on the utility or on how resources might perform. So these other scenarios, we'll aim to have 4 to 5 alternative scenarios in the IRP this year. Those haven't been decided yet. What the first place that I'm going to be asking for input from you all is in a really tiny little mini survey that we put together to have you hypothesize on what the future is going to hold. I'll be sending it out directly after this meeting, and if you're able to fill it out by Friday, that'd be wonderful. It's only 3 questions, so it should be really short and fairly easy to fill out. And then we'll be using that data next week to start kind of putting all this data together and deciding what the key scenarios that we think should be in the IRP. And then we'll be running those by you at the next meeting. Okay? Questions yet? Yes. Oh, we have a microphone coming.
I do have a question, but since I'm sitting to an honorable man here, I want to make sure he introduces himself.
Thank you so much, Javier Figueroa, my councilman. My name's Frank Boykin. Thank you so much for the latitude. I apologize for being late. Currently I've donated 2 major credit cards. Hopefully it helps someone out. But be careful. But with that, I guess I should pass this back. But it's good to be here. Looking forward to getting more out of the integrated resource plan, and hopefully this is not just time well spent, but for the folks that I care deeply about and like to think that I represent, they'll also see it as a really good way of spending time, getting good information back from this utility. Thank you, Frank. My pleasure.
So on the base case, under existing laws, other than the requirement of providing or writing up a plan, what other language or verbiage is there under the existing laws that is considered base case?
Okay, that's a great question, and we'll see some of that in just a minute. So a great example that we'll talk about in just a minute in a little more detail is the new Washington's new Clean Energy Transformation Act. So that has implications for what future build-out will look like in Washington, what prices will look like, and Almaz will probably touch on this as well. And there are also throughout the West, there are certain states that have renewable energy mandates, and so those are incorporated into our modeling. But we don't hypothesize sort of about, oh, well, other states that don't have renewable energy mandates yet probably will get one in the
only kind of do what's on the books right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question over here.
So when you're developing these scenarios, just a broader question here, what is the value or possibility for customer user input to that process? And is there any potential for like joint planning efforts and things like that to kind of solidify those scenarios, or is that something that you guys prefer to kind of do on your own?
I'm open to ideas. I'm sort of trying to understand what you have in mind.
Sure. So I mean, like, so at the port, for example,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that's kind of on my to-do list for this year is to get a study going looking at the sort of infrastructure requirements and sort of power requirements for electrifying cargo handling equipment and shore power and things like that. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, if we're able to do that sort of, put forth that sort of effort, is there a way that that plugs into something like this to help inform these scenarios or not?
I think it definitely could. I am not 100% sure on what our scenarios will be this time around. I think, yes, we should keep in communication about that, and even if what I'm sort of wondering is if the timing will work out.
Yeah. So for this year, it probably wouldn't.
Yeah,
I guess
but
I'm
I think,
kind of
yeah, as
longer
we
term.
move into the future, it might be really helpful, and we should probably do something for the next IRP.
But Rachel, you typically look at fairly wide load variation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the obvious kind of likely scenarios is, different load trajectories. More generally, I think there are kind of specifics in port electrification, for example, that might be different from general load growth, but we'll at least probably vary that like the load at a high level. It's highly likely that would be a scenario. And we can probably do a more thorough job for the next one. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to stay in touch about what you guys are doing. Studies. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just clarification is, are you going to make me hold that? Right? I know they paid you well to do that.
Well, we have people on the phone.
Okay.
How about people on the phone?
Hello.
I'm sorry. No, it's fine.
It's an echo. So on the random side of things, run many simulations with different weather and prices.
Mm-hmm.
You run many risk simulations with other factors, right? Not just weather and prices. I don't want to be stuck with just weather prices. For example, do you run the simulations because of the new laws that are going into place, like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Energy Act, as well as do you run simulations? And this gets into probably understand a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve under this plan, and that is if you had a cyber attack, are you able to deliver it? And then I'm talking about delivery versus load and availability. So if you can just expand on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah. So with different laws, I'll start with the first question. With different laws that we might expect to come into the future, that would be more in that scenario category on the left. The random variability really is just looking at lots of different historic weather years, so different water and temperature conditions, which affect how much water we have at our dams and affects loads. And then we also vary, as we'll talk about in a minute, natural gas prices, which is a major determinant of power prices. So that's the variability that we're running on that random variability side. Now, we do that for all of these different scenarios. And those different scenarios is where things like different laws come in. So that's the first question. And then on the second question, the IRP is more think what you're asking about is a really important question, and it's a really important thing for us to plan for. It hasn't historically been part of the IRP process. I don't know if it would be in the future. The IRP is traditionally been, it's kind of focused on making sure we have enough resources. It would be more, I guess our T&D folks, it would be focused on kind of that resiliency stuff. Time? Okay. Okay, so that's the uncertainty question. Now I'm just going to go over the major focuses of the 2020 IRP. So the first is that we need to make a recommendation about whether or not to renew a set of contracts that begin expiring in 2022. These are our Columbia Basin Hydro contracts. So this is hydro generation from an irrigation district, and it provides us with power when the irrigation district drafts down its reservoirs to irrigate fields. And so it comes primarily in the summertime. It's not a particularly large part of our portfolio, but we do have to decide what to do about it because they are coming up for renewal pretty quickly here. And I guess the big question for us is whether to renew them. If we don't renew them, do we replace them with something else? Or, you know, it could be that when we run our analysis, we find that we're okay without it and we don't need to replace it. So that is to be determined. But this is a question that's coming up pretty quickly and that we really do need to answer in this IRP. Second is that we need a much bigger and more important question is our Bonneville Power Administration contract, which is coming up for renewal in 2028. So this contract provides over 50% of our portfolio on an average water year, around 50%, and close to, wasn't it like 90% on the critical water year? Yeah, it's a large share of our portfolio on the critical water year, so a very low water year. Is that right? 90%? I thought that was right. So the 2028 is still 2 years away, but this is something we just need to start looking at in this IRP. We're kind of viewing this IRP as a test run for our analysis on the BPA contract, both because we're still in the midst of, we're almost done developing our new tools for the IRP and really building out those tools, but I think we'll be able to continue to refine them over the next 2 years. And the other thing is that we still kind of have a lot of uncertainties about specifically what products are going to look like in the next contract, how resources will be allocated, and you know, I think because this is such an important part of our portfolio, having a little more certainty around some of these big questions is going to be needed before we kind of come to any sort of final analysis of our BPA contract. So in this IRP, we'll start analyzing sort of what type of product from BPA might suit our needs best in the future, given what we do know today, and is there any potential value for us in, you know, adding some other kind of resource in addition to BPA. So like I said, I think because of this question, normally our next IRP would kind of be just a refresh with some changes in the input. I think it's going to look more like a full IRP again because this is a really, really important question for us. So that's another big one that's coming up. The Clean Energy Transformation Act I just started talking about. So another focus of this IRP is CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act. So this was passed by the legislature last year, and it requires that utilities meet 100% of their loads with carbon-free resources by 2045, and by 2030 we need to meet 80% of our load with carbon-free resources, and that next 20% can be met through alternative compliance mechanisms if we want, which energy credit or energy transformation projects, which are yet to be defined exactly how those will work. So I think there are several other requirements in CETA as well. So when the legislature passed this law, they left a lot of uncertainties in how it would actually be implemented, and a lot of those kind of details are being worked out in rulemaking at the Department of Commerce and at the Utilities and Transportation Commission. And so there are some uncertainties around how we actually do some of this. So in this IRP, what we're going to be doing is our best attempt at incorporating the law. And mainly we'll be focusing on these two things in bold here, which are kind of the more technical aspects of CETA and are the ones that would have an impact on sort of what resource we would actually choose or what portfolio would maybe be the best for us.
Rachel, there's a typo, I think. It's up to 20% of alternative climate studies.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes. Up to 80%. Yeah.
So it should be
20%. Yes, I apologize. We'll correct that in the slide. Send them out. So, another thing that we're really starting to address in this IRP that we're working on is to start modeling our systems taking climate change into account. Several years ago, we took a first step at this, and we contracted with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group to model what climate change would mean for temperatures in our service area and for inflows into our dams. So they ran their two fairly standard scenarios, a high emissions and a low emissions. And generally they found, not surprisingly, that temperatures are expected to be a little higher. There's a slightly bigger increase in temperatures in the summertime versus the winter. What this means for loads is that we're likely to see a little less load in the winter because we'll have a little less demand for heating and a little more load probably in the summer as more demand for air conditioning, because there's more demand for air conditioning. In some ways, this might be helpful for us on the load side, because we're historically a winter peaking utility, and we might have slightly less peak, but then we start having less peak in the winter, but then we start having new demand in the summer that we haven't historically had. So how that'll play out is a question. So on the inflow side, what we found, or what the study found, is that there's not really projected to be much of a change annually in inflows. It's about the same amount of precipitation across the year on average. But what we are expecting to see is some changes in the timing of the inflow. And so because temperatures are warmer, we'll see more precipitation come down in the winter, less of the water will be stored as snow, and the water that is stored as snow will melt sooner. So what happens is we get, like I said, more water in the winter and less in the summer. And that could lead to some new issues that we haven't had in the past and some stuff that we have to manage differently. Yep. Question?
This slide takes into consideration the impact on Tacoma.
Yes.
But TPU sells energy and water to other jurisdictions. So how much do we take into consideration the revenue that comes to TPU versus, because of climate change, versus just looking specifically at Tacoma?
So as we model this, the revenues that we get from selling on the market, that's a major impact on the value of a portfolio for us. And
which could drive because of revenue, that we're more interested in that rather than looking internally at the Tacoma system. Could.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
By looking California, other parts of the West that are buying power from us.
Yeah.
If we're just looking and giving our water to them or trading our power to them, rather than looking at the interest of keeping our costs down for low-income people, it can just have an impact overall. So I don't know how much we're looking at that in this process.
Well, I think, maybe I'm not understanding, but Jenner, do you have something to say, Clay?
Well, I can try to
Go for it.
help out, or make things worse, so.
And we don't need to analyze it all now,
Yeah.
because we have other meetings. I'm just
Yeah.
curious, because
Yeah.
we're just looking at specific climate change in Tacoma, and it's bigger than that.
Yeah, so a couple answers. First of all, we don't really look at the water side. That's a whole different utility, so we're just looking at power. Second, we look at what are the needs of our customers. That's our service territory, so it is broader than Tacoma. But we're looking at what our customers need and how we will supply those needs. We aren't building or buying resources just to sell to California. If we have leftover and there's 100 that we almost always do, that's what we will sell, and we use that revenue to keep rates lower and more affordable for our customers and service.
It's just a simple observation,
So maybe it's the word, since you do, you're really talking about the power load for the region. Maybe, did you put Tacoma there specifically because it's for Tacoma, or is it because, should it be reflecting the say impacts on TPU's service area?
So, yes, you're right. It should be TPU service area.
And that will be helpful to clarify, especially as you finalize the materials, because others could have the same view of that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Good point.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's TPU
so it's not
service
just
area.
Tacoma.
No.
right, okay.
And I will say, this study, the study that we contracted focuses on our service area. There are lots of other studies out there that look at this more like in the region or in other places. And as we start talking about how we model climate change, those are some of the things we have to grapple with is how do we model this, just because it does have impacts on the whole system, not just on Tacoma service area, Tacoma Power service area. But, so we're just going to start working on this year, I think. I don't think we're going to have, all of the West modeled with climate change well this year. This is the kind of first year we're really incorporating it into our models. So this is going to be our first stab at it. Okay, well, last slide. So there are some other new developments in the IRP this year. The modeling tools you're going to hear about in a minute. The metrics that we're updating we'll talk about in our next meeting, so I'm not going to talk about them now. These other three things are kind of changes to the environment that are important, but we're not necessarily directly tackling in this IRP. But if you're interested in hearing more, again, about any of these three things, come see me afterwards or email me and we can give you more information. Okay, so that's all that I had, and now we can go on to the really interesting stuff. I'm going to fill this one.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so this is either the interesting part or the part where you go to sleep, depending on how you feel about modeling. I actually love modeling, but I'll just tell you a brief little story. So I went to UW, and my sister worked across the street at University Village, and we carpooled every day. And so I tortured her daily about all the fun stuff that I was learning, and a couple of times she'd have to stay after work and attend my presentation or a presentation that I was attending. And at one point, so I was there for several years, and so at one point I was like, yeah, I got this 1 hour presentation and then we could go home. She was like, Mom,
I'm gonna sit in the car, okay? And I'm gonna sit in the car for an hour. She was like, I can't do it. I don't know if you ever heard that Charlie Brown, the teacher that's like, blah, 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 blah. She was like, that's exactly what it sounds like. So if that's how it is for you, I apologize. This is super interesting to me. I love it. So we're gonna get into something, not this.
That's new.
Where am I? I go here. Yeah. So I'll be that way. All right. I wonder what my look like to be like. Oh, it's just like better. Okay. So for those of you who've actually participated in an IRP process, this looks very familiar. They're modeling for the IRP. We have to look at things on a really, really large scale basis, and then also very, very small scale basis. So there's no one tool that you use for the entire IRP. You actually have several tools that you use and you kind of pull them together. The output of one model feeds into the input, as an input to the other model. And that's sort of like how things go here. Oh, I'm mobile. Well, I want to talk to you about Aurora, which is the model that I use. And then later on, Gareth is going to tell you about the SAM model. So Aurora is what we use to model, like I said, the WEC, the entire Western Interconnect, like 14 of the Western states, United States, a little bit of Mexico, and then the two Canadian provinces. And so the first step of that Aurora model is we look at all the policies that are in each and every one of those states, and of course what's happening in Canada as well, to the extent that we have information. And we look at what our resources in this region, this entire Western region, will look like in the next 20 years. So this is just to look at new resources and retirement. It's a really bulky model. It's not as hourly. It's not very granular because it takes a long time. So just for those of you who care, this model takes about 2 days to run. The output of this model is what we expect all of the resources to be like in the future. What's going to build, what's going to retire. And that gets put into the second model, which is also done in Aurora, but it's an hourly production cost model. And from that, we can determine what the power prices are going to be moving forward. And that is an input into the SAM model, because we respond to prices that are around us. We have surplus generally on average, so we're selling that surplus. And so when we evaluate our portfolio, we need to know what prices are. So the output of this is an input into the SAM model, and then there are some outputs of SAM that we then go into a little bit further, but I'll leave that for Gareth to talk about in the SAM model. So that's the modeling in a nutshell. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Aurora, what the inputs are, and what the outputs are, but I won't go into too much detail about the outputs because that's what we'll be discussing in future meetings. So, wrong way. This is a brief overview of the inputs into the capacity expansion model, and that's the name of that first model that I told you that looks at the build-out and retirement of resources. And it takes a ton of inputs. Like, you have no idea how many inputs this model takes in. And I want to go into the ones that are highlighted in orange. I'll tell you a little bit more detail about what we did and how we changed those inputs. But obviously, what comes out of this is the resource build-out and the retirement. And you also get the cost of these build-outs as well. So that's, let's go the wrong way. So the first thing, this is what the model actually looks like. So each one of these bubbles is either a state or a piece of a state. California is broken up into 3 different pieces, but each one of them roughly represents a state. And then there's these links that represent the transmission of power between each of these different bubbles. And so each bubble has within it power plants. So of these, there are over 5,000 individual units that are modeled in Aurora and put into each of these various zones. And you'll see this one right here, Washington. That one's the one that we are in. When you purchase the Aurora model, it comes with Oregon and Washington and Idaho bundled together as one zone. So one of the first things that we had to do is we changed the default. And we separated and created a new Washington zone. And the reason we had to do that was so that we could model the policies in Washington separate from the policies in Oregon. So that was the first step that we did. Any questions? By the way, you feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any time, but this is just a graphical representation of what our model looks like. And the details are all inside of each of those nodes, but we're not going to dive into those so much. Do you have a question right here? Sure.
Yeah, do you bother to run the model with the Washington, Oregon, Idaho funds together, just as a comparison with what your modified model gets?
Yeah, so when I ran the model just out of the box to see what results would come out of it. Then I separated them and compared them just to make sure that the model was running properly. So yes, we did do that. But when it comes to modeling the policies, we modeled them as the separated nodes. Question here and
Can you expand on policies? Now you talked about state.
yeah, so like with the Clean Energy Transformation Act that Rachel talked about, that's only valid in Washington. Nobody else is required to abide by that. So I'll tell the model, we need to meet, by 2045, 100% of our load has to be met by renewables. And so it will build out resources to meet that policy constraint in Washington.
So each node has a number associated with it. What's the significance, and is there any particular order?
No,
Okay.
totally random.
Just so I fully understand what the model does, this model really looks at the only the transmission and the generation. It doesn't really look at local distribution.
It is not, and it even for the transmission, it's very high level. So this isn't every single transmission line. It's the zonal model, so it's kind of aggregated. That's actually the point. And so yeah, so this model, like I said, I'm putting in constraints and telling it build out resources to meet this particular need. So like we know that loads are going to grow, for example, or we know that resources are going away, that coal is going away, which is in the next slide here. You can see this was the next thing that we updated was the coal retirement. So as coal is going away, we have to replace it with something else. And so the model makes decisions about what to replace these different resources with. So right now, it was showing by 2030, almost 7 gigawatts of coal would be retired. So it's a lot of coal that's retired in the region. This isn't Washington, obviously. This is coal that was retiring in the region. Another one of the updates that we did was, and this is one of the ones that's important because it drives build out, was the renewable portfolio standard. So in each of these different states, there's a different policy. Some states will say you have to have 50% of the load or the demand, electrical demand, met with renewable energy by, 2030. California, Washington, and New Mexico go all the way up to 100%. And some don't have an RPS at all, but we had to model each individual state's requirements so that the resources would build out to meet those requirements. So that's what RPS stands for, by the way. I should have written that out. It's Renewable Portfolio Standard. And it's the requirement of to build or to meet a certain percentage of your load with renewables. So that got updated. Now for Washington, Washington's kind of interesting, right? How do you get 100% of your load met with renewables when you don't necessarily know that the sun is going to shine, or the wind is going to blow, or that they'll be available? So for Washington, the policy is a little bit different than in other places. It allows for above 15%. 15% has to be met with renewables, and hydro doesn't count. But above and beyond that 15%, hydro does actually count towards the RPS. And so figuring out how to model this was a little bit interesting. Well, at least I thought it was interesting. So somebody asked a question about are we modeling if we kept all of the hydro here in Washington in order to keep the rates low? We wondered about the same thing. So
of course, how we model our own resources, which is how what Garrett will talk about, is a little bit different than when you're starting to model the entire WEC and the whole region. So you have to make decisions about what you think is going to happen politically moving forward. That law that says we have to meet 100% of our resources with clean energy by 2045 it says we can use hydro, but it doesn't say what amount of hydro is eligible. So right now, if you look at the load we expect to have in 2045, the amount of hydro that's generated in Washington right now is about 90% of that. Like it's already well above what we need to meet that requirement. But that's assuming that every megawatt hour of hydro that's generated in Washington stays in Washington. And right now that doesn't happen. Right now we export quite a bit of that. And so if we export that, then it means we're going to have to build more resources to meet this policy. So that's sort of what you were saying, which would drive up our costs. And we don't know what's going to happen. So we looked at different scenarios. What we know is that Washington has a 15% RPS by 2020, and that will not change no matter what. So at the very least, that's one scenario. We're going to have that 15%. But that means that all the hydro that we generate in Washington stays in Washington. And then this is our RPS. If we assume that all the hydro that we're currently exporting, if we continue to export at that rate, then this is what we need to meet the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It's the equivalent of almost a 50% RPS. So that's another potential future that might happen. And this one in the middle, as Rachel mentioned earlier, the law says we have to be GHG neutral by 2030. And only 80% of that has to be met with, of our load has to be met with renewables, and the other 20% can be other types of projects. So if we manage to get to 80% in 2030, and then we do something else about that other 20% and don't invest in generation resources, then this is what the RPS would look like, which is about 27%. And so each of these will require a different amount of build out, and we've modeled all three of them to see what they might produce. But our base case is this one. That's the one we selected, sort of the middle ground. It's assuming that we are going to continue to export, and also it's assuring that we get to that 80%, which is the absolute minimum that we're required to do. And then, of course, the last thing, CETA requires us to model the social cost of carbon in our planning. Yes.
Sorry, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but
sure.
How does privately owned distributed generation play into this, particularly that 15% you're talking about needs to be renewable?
So for utilities, what you do doesn't count for us. So we still have to meet 15% of our load with renewables. So if you invest in solar, it's good on you, but it doesn't reduce our requirements to meet the load. It might reduce your load, and so it reduces how much we have to invest, but it's not a one-to-one. He invested in a megawatt, so now that's a megawatt I don't have to invest in. Yeah.
So do you guys basically consider that conservation then when you're modeling this? Is that how that would be considered?
So do you consider conservation when you're modeling it? So we do consider conservation. Our load that we model is the load already net of conservation, and so it is included in there. And we can have other scenarios, for example, where we looked at, for example, more renewables built out on the distribution side, which serves to reduce our load, for example.
So back to the exporting.
Yes.
Obviously, it comes through some kind of agreements or contracts, and the length of those when they're renewable, up for renewal and all that. Can you speak to, does the modeling take into account contracts when they're renewed? If they're not renewed, how they may change? How does the modeling, take into that? Because once the contracts are renewed or changed or amended, that's an unforeseen situation. So contracts are not explicitly modeled in there. For example, our contract with Bonneville, for example, is not modeled in Aurora.
Bonneville Power is modeled in there, and it's assumed that we're going to have our load met with it, but it's sort of just, it's a really high-level aggregated model, and so it doesn't get into those sorts of details of contracts. Which is why for our base case, we're going this route right here, because it assumes the status quo, like whatever is exporting right now continues to be exported. So it's assuming no changes, but we know that it could go either one of those ways.
Okay.
All right. So let's run along here. I'm going to try to finish up real quick. Oh, and then the last thing, CEDAR requires us to model the social cost of carbon. So when we're looking at resources and we say resource X doesn't emit carbon and it costs us Y amount of dollars, the second resource is twice as expensive, it's cheaper, but it does emit carbon. We're going to add that cost to it, and so it could change our decision. We'll not take the cheaper carbon emitting resource once we have to add on the social cost of carbon. And it does, in fact, have that impact. So we're including that in our build decisions as well. In order for the model to select a gas plant, for example, it has to be cheaper than a renewable resource, including having this cost added on top of it. And so it makes it unlikely, yes.
Just the source for your social cost values?
So we are using, this question is about the source for the social cost values. So this is the Department of Commerce, this is from the interagency number on social cost of carbon, but this is what Department of Commerce is going to require us to use. So this is what we're using.
Get the 2.5%.
Can you give some examples of social cost of carbon? When you say an example of a social cost, so like that agency sat down and they went through like health impacts, environmental impacts, impacts to wildlife impacts, and it goes out 300 years. So it is truly every single impact, negative impact that carbon can have for a long, long time, and that got put into this cost right here. All right, so I'm going to blaze through this last one. So that's what we just talked about previously was the capacity expansion model. That's the model where we put in inputs to drive the build-out decisions, what's going to get built. This is the model that looks at, okay, once everything gets built, how much does it cost on an hourly basis to run this system? Now, what are the prices going to be that come out of this system? And so for that, one of the huge impacts, hydro has a huge impact on prices. So this is one of the variables that will change. Just going back to what Rachel said, those 280 some odd runs that we do, it's because we're looking at multiple water years. In this slide, we're looking at the monthly amount of energy that we got from hydro in the region. This is a regional number, but it's the monthly amount of hydro that was available in each of these different years. And you can see that the range, it can be twice as much water in one year than it was in the previous year. So it really does vary a lot. And then, of course, the more surplus you have, the cheaper the prices are, and then the less you have, the more expensive. And so we run our model. Like once we have this build out, we run it with all these different water years to see what the prices will be, and if the system can actually meet load. So there are some times when I'll run the model, and if there's too many renewables and not enough flexibility in the system, there'll be hours when it'll have to pull on the demand side to shut down load because there just isn't enough resources online. And so that's why we have to model with all of the different hydro years. It has a huge impact on prices. The second that we looked into was natural gas. Because natural gas tends to be the last resource that gets turned on, so they turn on all the cheaper resources first, and they keep turning those on until to meet load, and then the last resource that has to get turned on is the resource that sets the price in the market. And usually it's the gas plant that's the last resource that gets turned on, and so we want to know if something happens with gas prices, how will that impact power prices? So this blue Batman-looking curve are historic prices, and we simulated 5 natural gas prices based off of the historic variability. And so for every water year, we model 5 different natural gas price simulations. So we get a lot of variability. And the last thing I'll share with you is demand. It's another thing that impacts our power prices. This doesn't really give you a good sense of what the variability looks like because of what the scale is. But the truth is, so for the Pacific Northwest region, it was probably about a 5% change here or there. So you might have loads swing up 5% or down 5% just because the weather is different. In some of the California and Arizona regions, the variability was obviously much bigger. More sensitive to the load was more sensitive to weather. But we model all of that in there and measure its impact on prices as well. So for each one of those water years, there's a corresponding load to match that weather year.
Good question.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious, why do you stop at 2007, the last decade? It's a very interesting decade. I think I'll be a lot more representative of where we're going than where we've been.
I wish I had a better answer for you than what I'm going to have, but this is what the Aurora Energy Exemplar, which is the vendor that produces this software, they depend on publicly available data, and this is what's publicly available. They're always 10 years behind that, because that's what's publicly available. We have access to some of this data, but it's just a matter of me now putting it into the database, which we don't have time to do for this IRP. And so the future IRPs will have more recent years.
Is there a standard deviation for that load variance that you alluded to, or is that built in the model, or is that a wait and see scenario? Could you speak a little bit more about that?
So Danielle is the one that actually modeled the. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you can do that? Hold the microphone. Danielle modeled the load.
I don't have. Sorry.
Well, just tell us how you got these different loads.
Okay. I don't have the standard deviations readily available, but the loads are based off of publicly available historic loads for the past from the past 6 years, I believe, and that is used to model to create simulations from 1950 to 2007 based off of historical weather on an hourly basis. It's
Talk about uncertainty.
Yeah. So based off historic data, she's able to simulate what the relationship is between load and weather, and then she projects that forward with our forward forecast.
We did that off the last 6 years, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of like loads from the past 6 years, and the temperature sensitivity of those loads, and then we use that relationship to go back to those other previous temperatures. Oops, did everyone hear that? Okay, so then we go back to those previous weather years to apply that temperature sensitivity to get kind of those different loads in different years based on weather in those years. I don't know it off the top of my head either, but we could probably easily report it to you next time.
Thank you.
Awesome, and I think that's my time. Oh, one more question. Oh, just a moment. If we discover the standard deviations in the next 10 days, we can just put it in the notes too.
That would be super great.
I'm just curious, so you're talking about exporting the renewables in Washington State, and when you're projecting out renewables, you make the same assumption for importing renewables too. So say that Washington or another state in the region is importing all their current renewables instead of using whatever is there in the state from North Dakota or wherever else. Do you keep the same import as they say?
So the way that would be modeled, so there were two ways that I could have modeled that. One of them was that each state has its own renewable standard, and it has to meet it with loads, with resources within its geographical region. Another way to model it was to look WEC-wide. So the reason why I sort of had this dotted line right here was if I model that dotted line and I say build the resources wherever it's economic, and assume that it gets imported or the RECs that are purchased to meet that requirement. So we looked at two different ways of modeling it. One was, yes, you can have this exchange, either through, we assume REC purchases, or that it's actually, if there's transmission available, if the power is delivered, or you just have every state has to build enough to meet its requirements. Does that answer your question, or was that not your question?
No, that does answer it.
Okay.
So it sounds like you have a few different scenarios, like modeling.
If we looked at it two different ways, surprisingly enough, as the model built out fewer resources if every state had its own, which was counterintuitive to me. But that was, we did look at them both ways.
Thanks.
Yeah, does the model take into account or have anywhere to input transmission constraints?
So every one of those links has a maximum transfer or maximum capability on it, and so those are the constraints on it. And we don't assume any new build-out of transmission. So if there isn't enough transmission on a line, then and it won't build in a particular region, for example, if it can't give the power to the load, it'll build in where it can actually meet load. Okay. Does that answer your question, Bruce? Not really?
Well, it does.
It sounds like then the model takes into account, even if you told it to look region-wide for where the renewables would come from, it automatically will correct itself because
yes.
you couldn't put them in Wyoming all if it wasn't going to be able to get there because the transmission was going to limit it.
You're absolutely right. Okay. Thank you for the question.
So my piece on this is to answer the question, how will Tacoma's system operate in a given future scenario? So another way of stating that question is, if we were to operate our system for the next 20 years, then what will, for each of the 22 hydro generators we have and for each of the 8 contracts, what would their megawatt output be in each of the 175,000 or so hours in that next 20-year time period? So for every hour, we have to know where every single generator is. And on top of that, you move one generator, it changes the amount of water that flows into the dam below it, which affects how much those generators can generate too. So the whole system is tied together by constraints that are system-wide, like the requirement to carry operating reserves at the balancing authority. It doesn't matter which generator you carry them on, but they have to be carried as a system. So that kind of ties all the generators together, where any change on one could impact all of the others. So it's a pretty difficult problem to solve, and you need a model, again, to perform this kind of calculation. Essentially, what the model does is it makes decisions, the same decisions that we would make when we operate the system. It makes them in a very similar manner, deciding whether or not to ramp a generator up or to ramp it down. The model was not developed for the IRP. It was actually developed to run our actual system. And then we had it, when the IRP came around, it made sense to use the model that we actually use in the IRP planning also. So just a little thing about when you're modeling anything into the future, it's good to keep in mind that the past is very different from the future. We know things about the past. We know what did happen, and we have records of what did happen. So if I ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, many of you, because you had for breakfast, or if you didn't have breakfast. But if I ask you, what are you going to have for dinner this evening? Many of you don't know. Some of you, the planners among us, know what you plan to have for dinner. But even then, you couldn't tell me with 100% certainty what you will have for dinner, or even if we'll make it to dinner, right? And so if anything's in the future, it's uncertain, almost by definition. And that little thin blue line in the middle there is where we live our lives. That's where I'm talking to you, and that's where you're hearing me now. We can't live anywhere else other than on that line. And that's where we make decisions. So that's kind of important things to remember. This blue line here is our inflow into our CALIS project since the beginning of the year. And those were recorded, so we know what they were. In fact, this line goes back. It goes back a long way down this way. In fact, we have records of inflows into CALIS since 1950 that are pretty accurate. Right now, we're sitting right here on this blue line, and we really don't know what our inflows into CALIS will be in the next 10 days. But we do have some idea, and this green line, the National River Forecast Center, or Northwest River Forecast Center, does a forecast for us of what they think our inflows are going to be. It's based on the weather forecast, and it's not, it's like what you're going to have for dinner tonight. It's not certain. We don't trust this thing with absolute certainty, but it does give us a pretty good starting point for how we're going to operate our system. And so this is how we operate our system in real life, is we stand here on this line, and we look at what the future's inflows are going to be. And we use that information to make decisions to ramp up our generation. What happens here after that point, though? Do we have any idea what the inflows are going to be? So we have some idea, right? It's a continuous variable, so we know it's going to start from here. It's not going to suddenly jump to here, but it might go up or it might go down. Could it go up to 1 million, 10 million? I don't know. Could it go down to a negative number? Probably not, right? Actually, inflows can go negative because they're calculated numbers, but ain't going that far.
About uncertainty.
Yeah, so here's what we could do, and this is what we do, and you've heard it before in this presentation, is we know what has happened in the past. And what has happened is probably a good, probably safe to assume that what has happened in the past could happen again in the future. Not to say that it will, but it could. It's a possible future scenario. So 10 days from now, we're going to be in March, right? What if we follow this line back to March of last year, and we cut out March here, and we move that into the future, and we stuck it over there. And then we could go 2 years back and take March from that year, and then move it out into the future. And so that is what we end up doing. And this is how we operate our system in real life. If we look at all the possible futures after that 10-day time period, what could possibly happen when we make our decision. And so for the IRP, we're doing a similar thing. We're just taking 20 years of past weather, cutting out a slice, moving them into the future, and then that determines our weather. Now, as an example, I take the inflows into our project, because as a hydro utility, the inflow has the greatest impact on how we run our generators more than anything else. And it's very uncertain too, right? It's very variable. So if you get this green line, that's pretty high. Actually, this one you can see, we have had some pretty high inflows already this year. The model, what it has to do, in order to answer that question of where is every generator in every hour, it has to make decisions that will ensure that we can continue to operate the system reliably in any of these future scenarios. And so that's basically what it does for our hydro resources. But in the IRP, we're not only modeling our existing hydro resources, but other resources. So here's hydroelectric. We have three major projects: Callis, Swally, and Cushman. And then this bottom row here, we have a big site contract with CPA, and that's also subject to hydro variability and inflow variability. Block contract, which is less so, and then other contracts. And that's our current existing system. But the model allows us to plug and play resources, so we can take any resource that meets the interface requirements of for the SAM model. Essentially, the model defines a resource interface and says if you have these methods, then you can be considered a resource. So you model each of these other resources separately, and then you just plug them into the model and say, oh, I want a solar plant and two wind plants and a natural gas plant with these parameters, and then the model will dispatch all of those together. So it doesn't matter how many resources you want to add in, any number of resources with any set of parameters, the model will be able to dispatch it appropriately. Each of those resources, we have to tell the model what the specific constraints for each resource are, and each resource will have a different set of constraints. A solar resource will have max inflow capacity, and it might have a location, because the amount of sun in a different area of the country is going to be different. It's going to produce a different amount of megawatts in a different set of hours. So those will be the parameters for solar resource. A natural gas resource will have ramp rate, minimum uptime, minimum downtime, startup cost, all of those things, and the model will dispatch it according to those parameters. So for every, I'm not just trying to answer the question if we operated our system for the next 20 years, how would it be dispatched? But if we operated any possible system for 20 years under any weather scenario or any price scenario, how would it be dispatched? So each resource has a set of parameters. You combine those resources together into a system because a lot of constraints have to be met on a system level, like operating reserves and meeting the load, and then the model dispatches all of the resources together. There we go. Yes.
For those of us who don't work in power, what does dispatch mean?
Dispatch is a fancy word for determining the output of a specific generator. So, do you want 25 megawatts or 30 megawatts or 0 megawatts, right? And I use the term dispatch even for solar resource, even though the solar resource is not really going to be dispatched. It is going to produce a certain output. To the model, it doesn't care. It just runs the dispatch function, and for solar, the dispatch function is how much sun was there.
Thank you.
Great. This kind of shows you where it fits in the scheme of things. So the SAM model fits right here, trying to determine what the Coleman's generation or hypothetical generation is going to be. The one independent variable on here is the weather. We don't tell the weather what to do. It just tells us what it is. Let me follow this side. First of all, this is what Almaz talked about, right? So from the weather, we get weather determines regional inflows. Regional inflows, because there's so much hydro in our region, determines regional generation. The weather also determines the regional load. So we talked about the temperature sensitivity of the load. These two things, you have the supply and the demand, and those two things together determine the price, along with the natural gas price. And then, just like Almaz said, this is an input into the SAM model, because we dispatch our resources to the price, and then also to the load and to the inflow. So the weather determines our inflow, the weather determines Tacoma's load, the prices are fed into the model, and then the model, with this given set of resources, with this given set of parameters for each of the resources, dispatches according to these prices and those inflows and loads. All right, so just here's a recap, and then there's questions I'll take. So these are the three inputs essentially into the model. what are your resources, and you can just plug in extra resources or take out a resource and put in a different one. And you can switch these resources up through time too. So you can add a resource in 2028 or in 2035, and then take it out. The weather, so each of those runs, the 285 different runs, those weathers will determine different sets of prices. That same weather that was used for the Aurora run gets used for the Tacoma run. So our loads are correlated with the WEC loads, and our generation is correlated with the rest of the region's generation too. And then those prices, and the outputs of the model are hourly dispatch for each of the resources that meet all of the constraints for each of those resources. So no resource is ever going to be dispatched higher than its maximum capacity or violate its ramp rate or anything like that. And then it also, this hourly dispatch for 20 years also meets all of the system constraints, like serving the load or carrying sufficient operating reserves.
And likewise with the Aurora model, this the SAM model, the Tacoma reference is for the service.
Yeah, Tacoma Power.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Tacoma Power resources. Yeah, to serve our customers, whether they're in Tacoma. Yeah.
Can you go back one or two slides to that one right there? Oops, sorry, that one right there. So I'm curious on the prices coming in just from the region for the Tacoma generation. So, you know that now within Aurora, we're incorporating the social cost of carbon. $60 is now going up, right? That's part of our Tacoma IRP process, right?
In the build decision.
In the build decision. So I guess what I'm wondering though is if we have kind of the regional price determined, kind of flowing into the Tacoma generation. Is there a social cost of carbon placed on the regional prices as well then? That kind of
I could probably answer that. So the way we're going to handle that is there are kind of two thoughts on how to do this. You'll see some people saying, oh, let's put it into the actual price and then dispatch to that. That's not actually how we operate. So our approach to this is to account for the social cost of carbon on our market purchases. So when we're actually purchasing from the market, and that's resources that are what they call unspecified resources, where we don't actually know where it's from, we tend to use some kind of market average, I'll just say, as a kind of a proxy. It depends. You could assume different things, but basically we'll account for the carbon in the market purchases, and that's an actual cost in whatever portfolio we're looking at. So maybe a portfolio that results in us having substantially more market purchases than another portfolio might would have a higher cost from that social cost of carbon. Does that make sense?
Any other questions?
So we can make it a work.
Yeah. I won't start talking until you get yourself.
So I've heard about the weather and the cost of the fuels and all and your generation. How are you adjusting the load over time? What's the driving force there? How much of this is transportation, which was one of your bullets or points on the bottom?
Yeah, go for it if you can.
Well, there's the temperature obviously is from the weather. We use the weather. That temperature will determine the load. And then we use our Tacoma load forecast. And our Tacoma load forecast goes out to 20 years. And
Is transportation rolled into that?
that's a great question.
I mean,
So,
that's
yes, that's a great
a
question.
huge piece if we're going to
So,
move away from.
right. It is not beyond what has already happened and shows up in the sort of trends in load, in usage, customer usage. So this comes back to kind of that question of like, what if that may, at least in some way, modeling kind of like higher loads in the future might be a scenario. But it's not in our business as usual case because it's kind of projecting stuff that we haven't seen yet. So we call that maybe an alternative future that from that base case.
Is this for Gareth or is it for? Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Well, whoever it is over here, we can share that.
In terms of all the different, the plug and play resources that you have listed, I was just wondering if some of them are GPU owned or if there's different contracts in play too, like, are the decisions based off of really just like the technical parameters and price, or are you also looking at, like what GPU, like?
As for having it dispatched, or
Yeah.
which resources are actually showing up on the slide?
I guess in terms of what actually gets used first, like do GPU owned assets get used first?
Okay. So it depends, right? It depends on the type of resource. So if it's solar or wind, they're not dispatchable. So wherever they generate, they cost nothing to generate. So those generally go on the bottom of the stack. So those will, whatever the solar is, that will take that output as generation. Does that make sense? There's no cost to generating solar, right? As far as the hydro goes, we dispatch to meet our reservoir requirements. So we have to fill in the summertime and draft in the wintertime. So it's dispatching to meet a required elevation target in much cases, and it's dispatching within the constraints of meeting that elevation target. It puts as many resources in the high pressed hours as it can and takes as many out of the low pressed hours. There's different decisions you can make as far as which resource would you prefer to run, but generally it has to do with cost. You're obviously going to run the cheaper resource if there's such a thing. It's just hard to determine what the cheaper resource is sometimes when you have 100% hydro because there's no cost to run. Cost is an opportunity cost in the future. So you have to make that determination, and that generally comes down to, well, can I hit my reservoir requirement at this project when I can't hit it at that other project that I'm in different project? We haven't finished modeling resources, and this is not the whole list of resources. We don't even know what all the resources we're going to model yet. This is just a sampling of potential resources.
So essentially, you're generating a probability that you're going to have enough to be able to meet all of the needs you have, right? And it sounds like you're saying you're going for close to 100% probability of meeting those benchmarks, which means you have, no, that's not correct.
No, we'll be talking about the metrics next time.
We'll be talking about that in
But it won't be 100% necessarily on this kind of planning basis. Yeah.
I will hold that question.
Did everybody get that? We'll cover that when we do metrics next time. So we have about 10 more minutes for questions, if anyone has other questions.
Yeah.
And maybe if you have a question, just let us know who you're asking the question to as well. Just make sure the microphone is the right person. You guys really want to get to the 15th time.
Just a simple question on process. You talked about this going to the TPU board for approval. Does it also go to the council?
No. It just goes to the board.
So it's my understanding that Tacoma Power will be possibly entering the energy imbalance market. And I'm just wondering what, if any, impact it's going to have on this or future planning.
It may. Right now, this model is an hourly model.
Rachel, can you tell us what energy and balance market is?
So it is, I might not be the best person to explain this well. You want to do it? Okay, you'll do it better than I do, I think.
So the model that we're using for our system was actually developed for the energy balance market, because we will be joining, we're scheduled for April 2022 to join that market. It doesn't really change this planning at all, because you have to go into every hour in the EIM sufficient. So the way we plan generation for any given hour is really not is unlikely to change when we're in the EIM market. So essentially, as far as this long-term study goes, it doesn't change the way we would operate our system.
Gareth, can you tell us again what the energy and balance market is?
So it's a 5-minute and 15-minute dispatch of resources across the whole of the western United States. Started in California, but now it's most of the western United States.
Does that mean we're exporting more or less? What does that really mean?
Are we exporting more or less?
Surplus, the surplus.
I know, but whether surplus or obviously surplus. So, but does that mean that we're exporting, we're selling more?
You could be.
What does it mean to
Selling
be
more,
energy
selling
and
less.
balance?
Essentially, what the energy imbalance market tries to do is each balancing authority right now is transacting on an hourly basis, but there could be transactions I would be willing to make for 5 minutes of that hour, but not for the whole hour, because my load is going to keep going up, and so this first 5 minutes I would be willing to sell, but there is no 5-minute market, so, and plus it would be too much hassle to make that transaction for a 5-minute interval, so it just doesn't happen right now. But if you're in an energy imbalance market, they take care of the transaction details in one go prior to the hour. You basically say, I'm willing to do this hour, I'm willing to do this, go down this much this hour, and then the market does the dispatch so that the cheapest resources get run.
Okay,
Interesting. Are these models based on public utilities or public and private utilities? For the whole western?
Oh, the west-wide model, that is all utilities,
Public and private.
public and private.
And what percentage are public and what percentage are private? I have a guess.
Ooh.
I have to get back to you.
That's a good question. And I guess it would probably depend on you if you were looking at it based on load or numbers. Load would be mostly private.
So the percentage of utilities that are public or private could depend on how you look at it.
Yes, but we can get back to you.
Any other questions? Okay. Next.
On the phone?
Yes, any questions?
No
on the
questions,
phone?
thank you. No questions, thank you.
No questions, thank you.
Let's see if I can, is it like me? Am I going backwards? So that's
Oh,
backwards.
yeah, that's definitely backwards. Okay, let's see if this works.
Yeah.
Oh, that's going backwards, yeah, yeah. That I don't.
There we go. So the next step, what are we covering next? So in our next workshop, we're going to look more closely at the key inputs and discuss metrics, which I know everybody's really excited about, and different scenarios. We'll also review current situation in workshop 3. So where are we now, past and present, or present and discuss the resource alternatives. And then in our final workshop, we'll present the analysis results and discuss the preferred portfolio and any action items. And there are opportunities, homework for you to do in between.
I mean, this is just a more detailed look at what we'll be covering in the next meeting.
And there will be more in the PowerPoint that will get posted in the future. But there is that online survey that Rachel is sending out just after this meeting that we hope everybody gets an opportunity to participate in this week, so that we can include your thoughts in what we present at the next meeting. And let's see. Okay, so that would be the action item on your end. On our end, we are going to be, once we get those results, we'll be doing that analysis and being ready to report back to you, but we're also going to make sure we have these notes ready for you to review in 10 days. And we'll also be getting, a week before the next meeting, which is March 11th, we will have meeting materials online for you to review as well. And it sounds like there was a typo and a couple of edits to make to this presentation, and we'll also have that online for everybody to see too. In the meantime, if you have any questions that you want to ask anybody one-on-one, now is a good time. And we have cookies and fruit in the back. And, oh, yes.
I'm going to wait for the mic finally this time.
Thank you.
It's only based upon the workshop slide where we're getting a more detailed expectation about this workshop too. And I was just wondering, since you talked about the overall process and clearly having the two models, does this workshop sort of stay contained within our Aurora model, or will we see that blend as we continue to work through each of the workshops?
No, I've got it working. It won't all be concentrated on the Aurora model. The Aurora model is kind of the basis for a lot of the scenarios, so it's kind of what drives that price, and so it's the starting point. Once we get into kind of looking at how the portfolios are performing, that's more the SAN model. That's our system model. So that's where that other model will come back in a little more.
It does. I mean, you kept underscoring the build out, if you will. So looking at, as I see what is more in detail for the workshop, I was trying to get an idea of what we're going to spend more time assisting in the Aurora model in terms of expectation.
Oh.
But if it's going to continue to blend between the workshop engagement, no harm, no foul. I just wanted to be clear about that.
Okay, so I'll just be clear on this one. So the conservation potential assessment and the load forecast are more inputs into our system model. The WEC, the Western build out and the Western price simulations, that's more that Aurora model that we talked about. And then when we talk about current portfolio, that's kind of just describing what our resources are today, so that we're all on the same page about what our actual resources are. When we look at the metrics, the analysis framework stuff, so the metrics are actually something that we post-process from this model, the system model. So once we have sort of how are the resources performing, we have to take that data and actually turn it into what metrics we want to use to evaluate our portfolios. And then again, scenarios of the future is just starting to think about what we might be modeling in that Aurora, which will feed into the system model. Does that help?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question back here?
Yeah, I'm not sure who mentioned it, the next meeting is at March 11th, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't receive an email or anything on the schedule, so I don't know if you can send that out again.
I sure will.
Or if you could just mention now the dates for the remaining meetings that you have.
And the times as well. Yes.
And they're also online on the website.
They're on the website. I don't want to get the dates and times wrong. So maybe, you know what, maybe I'll just pull it up on the website really quickly. I do want to say the other meetings, I believe they're at 12:30 to 4:30. So I want to invite you all to come early and have lunch if you want, if you're interested. probably, I guess we'll have it ready by noon. So if you'd like to come early, you're welcome to, and have some lunch with us. Because I know 12:30 isn't everyone's favorite time.
No, I'm just looking at the workshop schedule.
Yeah.
So March 11th from 12:30 to 4:30. And then April 27th from 12:30 to 4:30. And then our final meeting is June 11th from 12:30 to 4:30. As Rachel said, there will be lunch for those who come at noon and an opportunity to have some more informal time with folks here. And then rooms are to be determined. It won't always be in this room.
Not necessarily. This room has more space, but we don't always have the option.
Right. So we'll make sure everybody knows well in advance.
Yeah, and we have to meet you at the guard, the security desk, and escort you anyway, so.
They'll always be here in this.
At TPU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But speaking of getting back to the security desk, does everybody need to be escorted back? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So we have a few people who might be able to help do that.
Anything else?
I think that's it.
All right, well,
Thank you.
you can't leave on your own anyway, but we'll take you out of the group. But if anybody wants to grab some cookies on your way out, if anyone did not sign in, please be sure to sign in. The sign-in sheets are back there. I believe that the most straightforward way out might be behind us, correct? Correct, but in any case.
Well, we have to take you out
Yeah.
anyway.
All right. So folks those of you who are ready to leave immediately, just maybe gather right there.
People over here.
And for those of you who are on the phone, thank you so much for listening and being patient.